Thank you for inviting me. This is really exciting to be able to talk about hummingbirds. As you mentioned, my research right now is not super hummingbird heavy, although I'm hoping to switch to that next summer once the field sparrow work has been wrapped up. But happy to chat more about that after my talk if there's any questions. But this is hummingbird time. I know we're all excited. I've had one hummingbird on my feeder here in Ridgely on the Eastern Shore. I'm assuming it was just moving through because I've not seen it again, right? A lot of birds are still shifting up and not on their breeding grounds. So I'm going to start with a little bit more depth than what I provided about my research, and then we'll get into the weeds of bird evolution and hummingbirds. So, with my research expertise, I did not start out as someone who was really interested in birds. As a young child, was rolling logs and looking for salamanders and snakes and frogs and turtles in my backyard in Northeast Pennsylvania. So, but I've always loved animal behavior. So, once I went to graduate school, is where I really fell into birds, and I've never left birds since. And I always tell my students at Washington College, if you want to ask behavioral questions and you look outside of your window, the thing that you'll see the most are birds. So they're a great model organism to ask really interesting behavioral questions. So I consider myself an avian behavioral ecologist. So my main interest is how the natural world, both the living and the non-living aspects of it, have shaped bird behaviors and how they alter their behaviors to minimize costs. So predation is really my favorite topic, and risk. So in graduate school, a lot of my research was focused on wintering bird behavior. So I've done a lot of research on wintering flocks of sparrows and how they alter their foraging behavior to minimize risk and increase their energy intake. And I've also done work on hypothermia, controlled physiological hypothermia in mourning doves as an energy saving mechanism. At Washington College, I've expanded out a bit more into more of the reproductive behaviors. So I've dabbled a little bit in tropical ecology with white-collar manakin lekking behaviors. And right now I'm in potentially the last year of this research question on whether parental age specifically affects how field sparrows alter their nest construction and ultimately their reproductive success. So field season starts on Monday. So wish us luck in finding all those birds and all those nests. But related to this specific talk, right, I have done a pretty extensive work on hummingbirds, both in graduate school and at Washington College. And those questions have all focused on, the risk and how perceived risk affects how hummingbirds choose to forage and how they use different physiological states to maintain energy and to build energy reserves. So at the very end of the talk, I'll go into more detail of my specific research on hummingbirds. But since this is a natural history audience, I want to go as far back as I can. I love evolution, so we are going way, way, way back. So if you humor me a little bit, we'll take a little venture back in time here. So I'm going to start with some evolutionary history of birds in general, and then get more into the natural history of hummingbirds and then specific hummingbird adaptations. So I always like to start out with birds are reptiles, just a statement of a fact here. And luckily, a lot of textbooks are starting to catch up with this fact. So this is a figure from a textbook, which nicely places our birds with their theropod ancestors, right? So not only are birds reptiles, they are theropod dinosaurs. So on this evolutionary tree from Hendricks et al. In 2015, birds are right down here at the most recently evolved group. You might also recognize some familiar faces in this tree, like the tyrannosaurs, which if you were like me and loved dinosaurs, right, that was a very charismatic creature that you probably fell in love with. So the fact that hummingbirds are these diminutive little theropod dinosaurs that we get to share the planet with, I can't imagine a more like inspirational and sort of romantic thing to embrace, right? As you can tell, I'm very excited about what I do. So, modern birds as we know it, their estimated origin is about 100 million years ago. There's estimates that range a little earlier, a little later, depending on the types of analyses being conducted, the types of resources used to build phylogenetic trees or to ask those questions. So we're rolling about 100 million years ago. At that time, not all theropods had bony jaws and teeth, like some of our theropods had bony jaws and teeth. Some of them had a keratin-based bill, which our modern birds have. But what we see in our fossil record, as you likely all know, is that at the Cretaceous extinction about 65 million years ago, all theropods that had bony jaws and teeth went extinct. And the only ones that remained were the theropods that had a keratin-based bill and not a bony jaw and teeth. And a researcher recently, well, in 2016, which feels recent, but I guess isn't so much anymore, developed the leading hypothesis that we're rolling with today, that the reason why our modern form of birds made it out of this extinction event was because of their ability to adequately use seeds. With that mass extinction events, we had a lot of loss of plant life, a lot of loss of animal life. So carnivores and herbivores were really suffering, whereas the granivores that could use seeds to their best usage had the resources available to eke by and to make it out on the other side. So it's a question we may never have the ultimate answer for, but based on what we see morphologically, that's a likely explanation. So with every evolutionary tree, these trees are built to, as a hypothesis, right? An educated guess about the relationships between different groups of organisms. Researchers are developing new bird trees, at least a couple every year. They're getting more and more of a stronger consensus about what some of these relationships are, but there are still a couple of groups that are enigmatic for a variety of reasons. So here's an example of one of those trees. This was constructed using 259 gene sequences from the nucleus of these different bird species. And I'm going to flip these so we can see them a little bit more effectively on their sides. And there's a lot going on here. So I'm going to hone you in on some of what I think are the most interesting or impactful things that are maintained throughout other trees. The first is that tinamous and their allies, which includes in this tree rheas, ostriches, are our most ancestral group. So they tend to be at the base of every evolutionary bird tree that we have. So they're really our oldest birds, our oldest theropods that we have alive today. The second oldest group are cousins with one another, and those are our galliforms and the anseriforms, which are chicken and duck-like birds. So they are also really ancient groups, which, as someone who lives on the Eastern Shore, waterfowl are really important for the culture and the economy, as it is throughout Maryland. So it's really interesting to think about how long these birds have been on our planet. Another interesting thing that I love to tell people is that parrots and falcons are actually close relatives of one another. So the next time you see an American kestrel, if you sort of strip away its superficial outside covering, its feather dynamics, it really looks like a parrot that has a murderous streak, if you will, right? So it's amazing that they're more closely related to parrots than they are other what we call raptors. And then related to this talk, hummingbirds are in the same clade or evolutionary grouping as swifts and nightjars. So some of these creatures that we wouldn't instantly think are close relatives are actually very closely related. Here's another even more recent tree. This just came out last year. Some of those relationships, as I mentioned earlier, are maintained in this tree as well, which is really exciting that we're starting to all convene on sort of the same story. I really like this tree for a couple of reasons. One is that it specifically points out where this group called Neoaves evolved. And this was about 67 million years ago, right at this branching point. So if you notice, all of the birds from group 3, which is this reddish orange color, if you can differentiate that color visually, all the way around through our passerines are from this same node, from this same diversification event. So this one branch of our tree yielded a lot of the modern bird forms that we see today. The tree branches on the other side of that node are our chicken and duck-like birds and our tinamous and their allies. So a lot of our new birds branch here, and this corresponds exactly with that Cretaceous extinction event, right here indicated by this KPG boundary. So what this is all pointing to is that the extinction of the larger theropod dinosaurs that had the bony jaws and teeth opened a lot of available niches that let new species evolve and fill in those voids. And this is called adaptive radiation. So Neoaves pretty clearly evolved into this really diverse group of modern birds that we see today. And the research that we see when it's overlaid with our evolutionary trees support that. We see huge population increases, an increase in genetic mutations, specifically substitutions that yield a different amino acid substitute like composition, which could affect protein structure, and then an increase in your relative brain size. So after this extinction event, we see this explosion of new stuff that really is conserved today and has given rise to even more biodiversity. So getting more specific now with hummingbird evolution, as a quick reminder, right, they're in the same group as things like our chimney swifts and our common nighthawks and our whippoorwills. All of them share the same clade. If I zoom in a little bit more here to this part of the tree that we saw earlier, that clade is labeled number 8 with the star. And I also want to point out that at the base of this node, there is a star right here, indicating that it's a pretty unknown or unlacking confidence as to where these birds came from. So this is one of those groups that they appear to be each other's closest relatives, but how close and when and why this clade evolved is one of the one that has less confidence than others. Regardless of how they got to this point, in modern days, right, we have 350-ish hummingbird species throughout the Americas. Ironically, the oldest hummingbird fossil that we've found is about 30 million years old from Germany, which is not in the Americas whatsoever. So we don't know how hummingbirds or why hummingbirds evolved in one continent, moved to another, and then was outcompeted perhaps in the other, perhaps by sunbirds or lack of resources. But that seems to be what happened. So the biogeography, again, is unknown, but might lead to some interesting questions. Hummingbirds are really widespread and very diverse. So just to give you a taste of some of that diversity of hummingbirds, the bee hummingbird, which is the smallest living bird on the planet and endemic to Cuba, only has an average mass of a little over 2 grams. Really incredibly small. The largest hummingbird, which is the northern giant hummingbird found throughout the Andes Mountains, is considerably larger than that tiny little bee hummingbird. And then our diminutive ruby-throated hummingbird, which is about 3.5 grams. So a lot of diversity of forms, a lot of diversity of sizes, which means really interesting adaptations and diverse ecologies. So now I want to dive more into the natural history of hummingbirds specifically, thinking about hummingbirds in a broad sense, and then narrowing down to our Maryland native ruby-throated hummingbird. So from a broad perspective, only 4% of species that are hummingbirds are migratory. We tend to think of hummingbirds as migratory, I think, right? Because being from the East Coast, that's what we're accustomed to. But in fact, very few species are migratory at all. Many of the hummingbird species are year-round residents of tropical or subtropical regions, and this has led to really intense coevolutionary relationships between the hummingbirds and the plants that they've become associated with as pollinators. One of my interests and expertise is tropical ecology, so this is something that I also will get off on a little tangent on as well. So in the tropics, there's incredible tree diversity, right? So flowering trees of the same species may be very, very, very distant from one another. In North America, they're quite close. So wind-driven pollination for plants is quite common. Pollinators that are more general is quite common. But if you are a tree that's flowering and your next conspecific is maybe a mile or two away, you need to make sure that your pollen gets to that tree. So we have a lot of species of hummingbirds that have evolved to be specific to a single plant species. So a lot of instances where a single plant relies on a single pollinator, many of those pollinators being hummingbirds. Oftentimes, this coevolutionary relationship is reflected in the bill size or beak size, and the beak shape and morphology of the birds that match the plant that's providing the resource. But we also see a lot of coevolution in our ruby-throated hummingbirds. So this is a picture of a ruby-throated hummingbird feeding from a cardinal flower, right? So, and the structure of these flowers is really interesting if you haven't noticed. They're very honed in on hummingbird pollination. So the hummingbird has to insert its bill entirely into the flower. The reproductive structures of our flower is up here at the top. So it dabbles a little bit of pollen on the back of the head of the hummingbird, which then moves to the next cardinal flower, which then picks it up on the pistil of the other flower. So we do have these coevolutionary relationships here. They're just not so as intricately tied one-on-one, but it is amazing to see. Reproduction in hummingbirds. Hummingbirds have a promiscuous mating system. Oftentimes you see it represented as polygynous. Technically speaking, that's incorrect. And since this group appreciates that sort of technicality, I'm rolling with it. Promiscuous mating systems are different from polygynous mating systems in that in polygyny, there's a social bond implied, right, between the male and the female. In a promiscuous mating system, no social bonds whatsoever. There's no male contribution to offspring anyway, and other than sperm contribution. So hummingbirds are a promiscuous mating system. There's no social bonds at all between the male and the female. After that reproduction, the copulation has happened. The female is on her own in really every way. Some species of hummingbirds have what is called lekking behavior. This is common in species like hermits. Long-tailed hermit is in this picture in the top right. During these leks, multiple males will congregate in a single area. They'll vocalize, they'll do tail displays, wing displays, flight displays to attract females, which then can essentially shop from all the available males at the lek and choose her favorite one. Wild turkeys do this. All right, so we're familiar in this in other ways, but in the tropics, some species of hummingbirds also use this sort of reproductive strategy. Other species do not use leks, but it's more of a one-on-one male and female display. These are really associated with more intense acrobatics, high rates of speed displays, feather displays. There's a really great example here in the Costa's hummingbird. The male is shown here in the bottom right. Like our ruby-throated hummingbird, a lot of the gorget feathers are structural. So when the sun hits in the right direction, they really reflect a lot of light. And this is what that display looks like. So the male extends out those feathers, which actually create this sort of strange multi-dimensional panel in front of the female, and he'll just move in front of her, right, to attract her attention and her evaluation of his apparent quality based on those signals. And these are called honest signals because they cannot be faked by that male. A male of poor quality would not be able to grow those sorts of feathers, maintain those sorts of feathers, do these sorts of physical acrobatics if it wasn't in a really good condition. So hummingbirds, again, thinking on this general big scale, again, have really diverse life strategies. Foraging can be somewhat complicated depending on what species it is. Some species only use trap lining. So trap lining is a kind of foraging behavior where the hummingbird visits a particular sequence of flowers throughout the day and will make sort of foraging loops depending on the amount of resources that those flowers are producing. Some species are territorial and will defend a single resource. And others are opportunistic, especially smaller species that aren't competitively superior in the tropics there's multiple species engaging. They won't fight for it because they can't, so they will opportunistically feed when the opportunity presents itself. Hummingbirds, interestingly, are only one of 3 groups of birds that exhibit vocal learning, so the ability to learn vocalization styles and techniques from other individuals of their species. The other 2 groups of birds able to do this are parrots and passerines, or our perching birds, our songbirds. And hummingbirds, for a while, historically speaking, scientists sort of assumed that hummingbirds really didn't have many predators at all, which is blatantly false. They actually have many very opportunistic predators and arguably more variable predators than other birds do. And this is partially because of their ecology and their small size. Really, anything that can eat a hummingbird will eat a hummingbird. And this ranges from mammals to amphibians to other birds to arthropods, including this picture was taken in Chestertown of a Chinese mantis eating a ruby-throated hummingbird in an azalea bush. So it's very striking to see this. They can snatch them right out of the air. They eat them. It's very dramatic, a little traumatic perhaps to see this happen, especially from an invasive species like a Chinese mantis, right? There's a whole philosophical argument that might happen inside of your brain if you see this, right? But everything could eat them because they are so small and accessible. So this makes their, in my mind, their behaviors or antipredator behaviors really interesting. If everything can eat them, how do you respond accordingly when anything could be a threat? And this brings me to our ruby-throated hummingbirds. So Archilochus colubris is the scientific name, our only resident or non-resident, really, migratory hummingbird in Maryland. So ruby-throated hummingbirds are sexually dimorphic. This is a result of that very picky female reproductive style, choosing different types of phenotypes or physical representations of traits. Females tend to be larger in size with white tips on the outer edges of the tail. Juveniles resemble females, so if you don't be fooled into thinking that all of a sudden you have a lot of females at the end of the summer, right? Those are just that year's crop of juveniles getting ready to migrate. And then the males have that iridescent red gorget and a black mask. Something that's interesting to note is that all of the coloration of our ruby-throated hummingbirds are structural. So our hummingbirds are shades of tan and brown and a little bit of black. So the colors that's reflecting back is due to the physical surface of the feather. So depending on that physical surface, it will reflect different wavelengths of light, which makes a really dramatic appearance, right? For that male, especially, that can go from looking black to this really bright ruby throat, hence the name. The ruby-throated hummingbird range extends throughout all of eastern North America and through the Canadian prairies. And something thing I like to note here is this sort of cultural shift that I think is important for us to make. We tend to think of all migratory birds as, oh, our birds are coming back to us, right? Our birds are back. Really, our birds in air quotes, our ruby-throated hummingbirds, are just visiting us to breed and then they go back home, right? So where they spend most of their lives is in southern Mexico and Central America. They visit North America to reproduce because our primary productivity and our plant production exceeds that of the jungles in our spring seasons, which is the big draw of all of our birds coming north. I said it there, all of our birds, right? So just keep that in mind, right? That our migrants that are coming through right now, which is really exciting, are really jungle birds that are just coming to take advantage of the resources and then going back home. But anyway, so there are parts of North America that hummingbirds do spend more time. So southern Florida, for instance, they will be year-round residents. It's not the same birds that stay there, right? They're the birds that have shifted from farther north. But Florida being what it is, they have adequate resources to remain there. They seem to take two different routes. They either travel around the Gulf of Mexico to get between their breeding and non-breeding grounds, or fly straight across the Gulf of Mexico. And this seems to be the preferred route of the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is wild since they basically weigh the amount of a piece of chalk. So they fly straight across the Gulf, which is about 500 miles and 20 hours nonstop. So, and these birds live for multiple years. So some of the birds that I've done research on here in Maryland have returned for several years, the same birds, because I've recaught them and have read their leg bands. So that's amazing. A 2.5-gram bird being able to make this trip 6 times. It's impressive. And their migratory behavior is triggered by photoperiod or changes in the day length and not resource availability. So please leave your feeders up all year round to catch those vagrants, those lost souls that need some resources to make it through, sometimes even the winter months. So day length is the big cue here and not resource availability. Hummingbirds, ruby-throated hummingbirds are nectivores, but arthropods are a really important aspect of their diet. They spend a lot of time catching small insects, pulling spiders out of their webs, because every growing or even just existing body needs protein for cell growth, cell repair, tissue growth. They do prefer tube-shaped flowers, and they are trapline territorial foragers. So you may have one hummingbird that visits your particular feeder at home, and that might just be one sort of step in a longer line of feeders that they take throughout the neighborhood, right? So it's pretty, if you sit on your porch and watch long enough, you may be able to sort of map out what their trapline system might be. In North America, they do prefer edges and meadows, which is why backyards are such a conducive place for them to exist and to thrive. In the tropics, they tend to be found in groves, scrubs, and more of the dry forests, which is, if you remember the map of Central America, they tend to be more on the Pacific coast, which tends to be a bit drier than the Caribbean side of Central America. The courtship of the ruby-throated hummingbird is pretty spectacular. I hope you've had a chance to see this at some point in your life. The males do these incredibly large sort of U-shaped dives. Some measurements have them going up to 100 feet high into the air and then diving at about 50 miles per hour, which is almost as fast as essentially their feathers can handle before they start pulling out, I would imagine. And during that dive, the feathers themselves actually generate a sound. In addition to the sound of their feathers, they're producing vocalizations. And then when they round this corner and the light hits that red gorget, that's where the female is. So it makes this big red flash at that female as they fly by. So they will do this back and forth to get the female's attention and interest. If the female shows interest, they shift to this rapid side-by-side movement. And this might be something more that perhaps you did see. It's a little bit more obvious because the bird is in view the whole time. So it'll go side by side in front of the female, fan out the tail, put out that gorget, and she's assessing that male and his abilities. If she likes him, they will copulate and their relationship is over. So, and that leads to nest construction. So females are the lone builders and caretakers of offspring in the nest. The nest takes up to 10 days to build and is usually positioned right on top of a branch. Some species of hummingbirds will put them in sort of the V of a branch, but they usually go right on top of the branch. The inner cup is the size of a thimble. If you're not familiar with how big a thimble is these days, it's about the first knuckle of your index finger. Incredibly tiny nests, very difficult to find. If you do find them, though, they're such a treat to watch from a distance. They're put together with plant fibers of a variety of nature, grass, and spider webs seem to be a really important component that the birds will use to wrap and contain their nests and then to adhere that nest to branches. So I've seen this a number of times out in the field when I've been studying my field sparrows of hummingbirds going and actually removing early in the morning the spider webs in between the grass stalks and collecting the spider webs and then flying off with them somewhere. So really, again, fun to watch if you're cued into these very specific behaviors. They do collect a lot of downy plant material to line the nest to make it insulative and soft for developing offspring. And then they do cover the nest with a combination of a lot of lichen usually, but also some moss. We think as scientists and as people, right, that this is for camouflage. We really don't know, but that's our best guess as to why they might do this. Okay, offspring care. So these are incredibly tiny offspring. So the eggs are about the size of your index finger nail. So very tiny chicks. They typically lay 2 eggs per clutch. They can lay up to 3, but usually only 2 chicks will make it with about a 2-week-day incubation period. The nest, because of its construction and with it being built with those spider webs, can actually expand and grow as the chicks grow, which is a great feature to maximize, right, the thermal efficiency of that nest. And then those birds will fledge or leave the nest after 20 days. All fledglings after they leave, which is shown down here in the bottom right, are still under parental care by the female for at least a short window of time. So still a period of high risk for that youngster. The young throughout this period are fed primarily insects. They seem to get very little nectar, in fact. Again, with growing bodies, when you need to build mass, you need to build protein and muscle, you need protein to do that, right? A high sugar diet will not get you the full array of nutrition needed. So young birds often get very different food and diets than their adult counterparts do. All right. Now we're going to shift more to the adaptations that really make hummingbirds stand out from other birds. All right. Some of the adaptations that hummingbirds have for flight, again, are pretty remarkable, just like everything else we've talked about. So hummingbirds are the only hovering specialists on the planet. All birds can hover, except for maybe the birds that are flightless, right? They can do it to varying degrees, right? You've probably all seen osprey, being Marylanders for the most part, hovering. It takes a lot of work. They have to work really hard to do it. And that is because for a lot of birds, this downstroke muscle, which is shown here, the pectoralis major, is bigger than the upstroke muscle, right? So they have a really powerful downstroke and a weaker upstroke. So they have to work really hard. For a hummingbird who specialize in hovering, these 2 muscles here that power the up and down are approximately equal. It's the only bird where we have approximately equal flight muscles for down and upstroke muscles. And this is to facilitate effective hovering. When hummingbirds fly, their wings are very stiff compared to other bird wings, and they also have very little curvature. They're quite flat. And this maximizes lift for this style of flight specifically. So a hummingbird does not have that up and down flapping motion that we typically associate with birds. It's more of this horizontal figure eight pattern, which you can see especially here where it loops back around and sort of rotates back in the opposite direction. This creates lift not only on the top of the wing, but also on the underside of the wing to keep the bird in the air, whether they're pushing their wings to the front or to the back. For these reasons, hummingbirds are also the only birds on the planet that can fly backwards, which is also a cool, fun fact. Unfortunately, with all this amazing flight physiology, flight in general is a very costly, energetically costly behavior. They have the highest metabolic rate of any vertebrate, and this is associated with their body size, right? So it's relative to body size. So for instance, if you could take a single gram of a hummingbird tissue, a muscle, and a gram of elephant muscle, right? And you put those in a metabolic chamber, the hummingbird muscle is just off the charts, using so much energy and resources. Whereas on the other side, right, when you have a larger organism, as a total, they have a higher metabolic rate, but their actual per gram of muscle needs less energy to fuel it. So they are like intense, high energy metabolic machines. That comes at a huge cost. So a lot of adaptations that hummingbirds have facilitate effective foraging of nectar resources. So one of the really cool adaptations that hummingbirds have is their tongue. So their tongue is incredibly long to access nectar at the bottom of flowers. And for a while, we thought that hummingbird tongues acted with capillary action. So it's similar to when you put like the bottom of a paper towel in water and you see the water sort of creep up because of the polarity and the charges of water and the molecules in the paper. And that is in fact not how hummingbird tongues work at all. So focusing on this figure here from this paper in 2019, the way that a hummingbird tongue works is that they're actually structured as these two parallel C-shaped tubes, right? So, and these tubes, because they're condensed when they're inside the bill, develop potential energy, if you think physics, right? It's trapped energy that when released and the tongue is expanded, can act to actually trap the fluid within those structures of the tongue. So it traps the nectar in this pumping action, which is brought back into the bill. When the tongue is pulled into the bill will actually contract around the tongue and squeeze out the nectar. And then the tongue is flattened and then the process starts over again. So it's actually a really sophisticated pump and an anatomical pump and much more complicated than we thought it was. And we didn't know this until a few years ago. So we're still learning a lot about hummingbirds. Now, if you think about the size of this hummingbird tongue, you might wonder, like, where does that tongue go, right? Like, it would just clog the mouth. The mouth would just be full of tongue. Another really amazing adaptation. So hummingbirds and also woodpeckers that have perhaps even proportionally longer tongues have a structure called a hyoid apparatus that wraps around the back of the head. So when the tongue is brought into the mouth, it enters this canal and actually wraps back behind the eyes and back on top of the head. And then when it's brought back out, it comes back out of that sheath and then outside of the body. Amazing. I don't know what else to say about it other than just amazing. Now, eating nectar is a really difficult food source. So although it comes with a very high reward, very high energy, it also is high in water. And like all birds, hummingbirds produce uric acid as a nitrogenous waste. So if you see bird poop or bird excrement, the white component is their functional urine is a semi-solid, right, to conserve water, because birds have evolved to be a really terrestrial focused organism, which means water conservation. Hummingbirds, it's acting against their favor here, right? They don't need to conserve water, they need to get it out of their body. It's too much to process and can actually be really detrimental to how the body can function. So the hummingbird's kidneys are really pushed to the physiological limit of what we know a vertebrate kidney can do. So instead of putting all of that fluid that's collecting from the nectar into their kidneys, which are working to the max, they just send it right through the digestive system without any kind of processing at all. This is really strange for a vertebrate physiological and anatomical system. All right. So the nectar, the sugar, and all the resources are pulled out, and then the water doesn't pass the kidneys at all. It just goes straight out. So if you see a hummingbird at rest, and you see what looks like water come out, it is just water. It's not urine at all, typically. It's just water going right into the mouth, through the alimentary canal or digestive system, and out the cloaca. Amazing birds. Now, another physiological strategy or advantage that hummingbirds have to help cope with their really intense need for energy and resources is a physiological state called torpor. So torpor is essentially a physiological shutdown of the body. It's under intense control. So it's not just that they're just shut off and hope for the best. They're downregulated in a very controlled way. So this is a thermal image of a hummingbird that's in its normal resting state at like the start of the night. You can see brighter colors means hotter temperatures. And then throughout the night, the same bird is cooling off to essentially background temperature. So this lets them save an intense amount of energy. With an internal furnace that's so hot and so stoked all the time, at night especially, they're going to waste a lot of energy keeping that fire stoked. It's better to turn it off, save it, and then just turn back on in the morning. So that use of torpor is a huge metabolic drop and associated body temperature drop. And this is really critical for birds like our ruby-throated hummingbird that migrate. Torpor is incredibly important for our ruby-throated hummingbirds to build up fat to prepare for migration. They would not be able to build up enough fat to make that migratory journey, especially that route over the Gulf of Mexico, if they could not use torpor. This is also a state that they often use to withstand stressful conditions. So even if we get like a cold front comes in June, a lot of our ruby-throated hummingbirds will use torpor during the nighttime hours to maintain the energy reserves that they have. If you have hummingbirds that get trapped in your garage or whatever and get exhausted, they might start to go into torpor because they're running low on energy, which is where a picture like this sort of comes in on the top right here, where this bird is torpid, its tendons are tightened, and it's just shut off. So when hummingbirds are torpid, torpor comes with a huge reduction in behavioral responsiveness. So the bird that's shown in this looping GIF on the bottom right is a ruby-throated hummingbird who is torpid and it's trying to wake up quickly. It was probably disturbed by those researchers, right? It's like, oh my God, I gotta warm up, I gotta warm up. Otherwise, if they're not disturbed, they just sit there and do not move. They can't respond to stimuli, they can't open their wings, they can't do anything. And this leads me to some of the research that I've done on hummingbirds. And I really hope to continue this research at Washington College too. I think it's a really important question and one that's difficult to answer, which is why it's taking me so long to get to the bottom of it, but hopefully someday I'll have some answers. So with torpor, and if you've essentially shut yourself off, you're a sitting duck, if you will, pardon the pun. Anything could just come up and eat you, a mouse at night, anything, right? You're just sitting there at risk. So one of the research questions that I asked when I was a graduate student at Indiana State University was if hummingbirds use torpor differently, if they perceive different amounts of risk. If it's more dangerous or if their perception of greater risk, do they use torpor less or don't use it as deeply to maintain some behavioral responsiveness, or is it unaffected? So what I'm going to show you now are some results that I found from that research in graduate school. It never got published because the error bars are like a mile long, but there are some interesting trends that I'll talk about. So what I did at Indiana State University is I trapped hummingbirds, brought them into the lab in a temperature-controlled environment. They were held at 21 degrees Celsius, which is a comfortable late spring day, right? We're given a 2-day acclimation period and then 5 days of disturbance. So the disturbance for me, and you might laugh at this and that's okay, was a 4-centimeter foil ball and a dowel rod. For a hummingbird, this is something that they've never seen before. What is that? Oh my gosh. The idea was this is something new. Maybe it's very dangerous, right? So I would go in and disturb the bird and then let it rest, right? So 5 nights of, oh my gosh, this crazy thing on this ball is coming into our cage. And then an additional series of monitoring days. So these are some of the results that I found. So we have some birds in our treatment group that were given that disturbance period, and then the control group was not given the disturbance period. Again, here are those giant error bars, which means that there was a lot of variation in what birds were doing. But the overall trend is that the birds that were in the treatment group that were being disturbed in that period of time did tend to use torpor less during the night than the birds that were left alone. So again, just speculation here, not statistically significant, which is why it's not published, unfortunately, but something interesting to note. In addition, and this was a significant effect, but not an unsuspected one. This is supported well by the literature, and that is that torpor is used more frequently later in the summer than earlier in the summer. And this coincides with their need to build up fat for migration. So the first half of the summer, many birds and some nights weren't using torpor at all. They were just sitting regular body temperature, no problem. Whereas later in the summer, they were spending a lot more time in that torpid state. All right. This is leading up to the second research question, and then I promise we'll be on our last few slides here as I'm looking at the clock. And this is research that I did at Washington College, and I published with a student in 2020. And this was looking at how natural variations in risk or perception of risk affect foraging behavior. And this was motivated by the fact that being a small bird, even a small insect like a wasp might be a significant threat. So to do this research, this work was done on free-ranging birds, so we had to be able to have an idea of who was who at our site. So we built some traps to catch the birds. The birds would fly in. When they were inside, we'd pull this string, they'd be trapped inside, a la Bugs Bunny on Looney Tunes with the carrot in the box. And then we would mark the birds with Sharpie, which is a non-toxic dye, right, with different colored stripes on the throat. That way, when they came in to feed on our video cameras, we could see who was who, how many times they were visiting, if they were male, female, which was obvious, but female versus juvenile was a helpful distinction. So here's some more pictures of what those colored birds look like, and also an additional reminder of the size of these birds, very, very small. So the natural source of variation in risk was just the natural presence of yellow jackets or bald-faced hornets on the feeders. So there were some days where there were wasps present, some days where they were not present, which made a great natural variation in what that risk might be, if they perceived it as a risk at all. We also provided the birds with 2 different visual environments. So we had 2 feeders in different combinations. Some had a flat target shown on the left-hand side. Others were this conical shape, which would obscure the view of the bird coming in to feed and perceivably be a higher risk foraging scenario. So this is a video of what some of those foraging interactions looked like, if I can get it off of the pointer. Let's see. So what you'll see here is a hummingbird coming in to feed, and then a yellow jacket enters and chases the bird clear away. The bird left and never came back. So the yellow jackets, and you maybe have noticed this at your own feeders, and I'll play this again, are really aggressive, very persistent, and the birds do seem to be incredibly hesitant to engage and interact with yellow jackets. So this was really an intriguing thing for us. So we wanted to know, do birds do things differently if those wasps are present? So these are the results that we found. We found that birds do probe more often at cone feeders. So they stick their bills in, out, in, out, in, out, in, out, more often if their view is obstructed, which means that perhaps the visual obstruction does mean higher risk. We also see that the amount of time that the birds spent vigilant or watchful and not feeding during a visit was greater when there were more wasps present. Again, coinciding with this idea that hummingbirds are responding to wasps as an actual potential threat. And we also found that birds switched feeders more often when present, because birds had those two feeders present. If there were wasps, they would often switch from one feeder to another. If there was no wasps, they would just come in and feed and then they would leave. So to summarize, the research suggests that hummingbirds perceive the wasps as high risk. Whether the wasps are real predators by definition, we don't think so, right? We don't assume that a yellow jacket wants to eat the hummingbird, but it's acting as though those wasps are a threat. We also found that not all antipredator behavior in birds is created equal. If it's a visual obstruction, probe rate mattered. Taking those quick little glances was more important. If wasps were present, however, spending more time watchful, probing didn't matter, being watchful is what seemed to matter. So what we concluded is that because of the high energy needs of hummingbirds, interactions with wasps could be a really considerable impact on the energy needs of hummingbirds and their ability to maintain energy balance. So in summary and in conclusion, hummingbirds really do push the limits of everything we know as what works, in air quotes, of vertebrate biology, including flight, thermoregulation, and physiology. And a lot of what we're learning is still unknown or don't have really solid answers. So it's exciting to know that there's a whole world out there to ask questions about. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. I hope I didn't speak too longly, and I hope you learned a lot.
Thank you so much. This was amazing, and people are chomping at the bit to ask you questions, but you can unshare, come back, and we'll put a spotlight on you.
All righty.
All right. Well, I certainly learned a lot.
Good.
Yeah. So some of the earlier questions you answered later on. And if I don't get to it, just put it back in the chat box. So, Basil asks, when do they nest in our region?
So nesting typically happens in our region from, I would say, mid-June, and the latest would be mid to late July, or early August might be the latest. Usually by early August, they're making their way south. Unfortunately, when I was in graduate school in Indiana, which is a similar latitude, I did catch one female that happened to be carrying eggs, which I felt awful about it. And that was in late July. I thought by then they would be done. And apparently she was making one last attempt. So I would say anywhere between early to mid-June to late July would be a best estimate, with some wiggle room on either side, depending on the bird's energy reserves and weather conditions.
Jess was curious about that long flight over the Gulf of Mexico, and you sort of answered that with the bulking up with insects and going into torpor. And but have there been any other studies about how they can make that long flight given such their high metabolic rate, or do they just do they run out of energy and just fall into the water, or they wait for special winds to be right, or how do they do it?
Yeah. So with long migratory journeys like that, a big risk is running out of fuel on the way there and falling into the ocean. I think a lot of migratory birds die in that way. Um, and oftentimes you see migratory fallout along the edges of where birds end up, right? Of exhausted birds on cruise ships, oftentimes, like out in the Gulf, if a weather system comes in, all of the birds that were migrating just come down on that boat. So you might have seen some videos and photos of just like a cruise ship or a fishing vessel. They're amazing photos. Definitely look for photos of migratory fallout of essentially every warbler you can imagine all hanging out on the same boat together, just desperate for relief. So that is a really big real risk for birds, including hummingbirds. The amount of fat that ruby-throated hummingbirds pack on is enormous. So when I had them become migratory in the lab when I was at Indiana State, they would double in size. There was one male that was so packed with fat that it almost looked like a circular like orb. And when it flew, it was almost like in slow motion. It was so big. It was like 5.5 grams when it was supposed to be about 2.2 or so. It was a huge bird. So they pack it on a lot. There's a lot of other birds that do really amazing restructuring of their internal organs, like a lot of shorebirds will totally break apart their digestive system and will reabsorb their intestines and deposit it as fat. And then when they arrive and eat food, it triggers the regrowth of their whole intestinal tract. So birds can do a lot of wild things, and maybe hummingbirds are doing a little bit more of that too, but honestly, I don't think we know. But they do get very fat. And they do also time migration with favorable winds. So they will not attempt that migration with a headwind. They'll only do it with adequate wind to their back to push them along the way.
Well, I don't know if are there sensors uh, small enough to put on a hummingbird to track them that across.
We're getting there technologically. We're getting there. I don't know of any researchers who are currently studying that, but birds that have been tagged and have been found on boats and things like that are really our best guess at this point in our intellectual journey. Yeah.
So Steve asks, do the cognitive abilities of hummingbirds decrease in environmentally complex habitats?
Do their cognitive abilities decrease?
That's the question, and if that makes sense, or he can.
Sure. I mean, I can
Explain.
definitely take a spin at this. So, there's been a growing amount of research being done on the cognitive ability of hummingbirds in general. So there are some researchers that are studying like hummingbirds' memory and learning skills. So almost giving them a bit of a puzzle, right? A board with different types of resources to feed to see if they can learn cues and sort of track where high value resources are. A lot of this research is being done on tropical birds, like resident tropical hummingbirds. And they seem to be, I don't think there's any suspicion or reason to suspect that they are performing any differently than ruby-throated hummingbirds. But I would say that ruby-throated hummingbirds being long-distance migrants and tropical hummingbirds not having to devote resources to that same behavior would be using the resources either neurologically or physiologically that would be devoted to migratory behavior to other things. Maybe it's lekking behavior, maybe it's learning how to trap line forage differently. But I don't think we really have any good studies that compare cognitive abilities between resident tropical hummingbirds versus migratory hummingbirds. So I think it's a really great question because it's a very different ecological scenario for those birds.
We have lots of great research questions coming at you.
I love it. Keep them coming.
Greg wants to know, is torpor also a mechanism to manage body temperature? Because you mentioned that it was used more frequently late in the summer. Could that be a temperature regulation as another driver?
So torpor as a mechanism of reducing metabolic rate, as a result of that reduction in metabolic rate, body temperature goes down. It's sort of a coupled physiological reaction. Hummingbirds do not seem to use torpor during periods of activity to be cooler on a hot summer day because it does impact their ability to like respond and function. Their muscles, birds in general are very hot. Their normal body temperature is 42 degrees Celsius, which is about 104 Fahrenheit. So their muscles are have evolved to work optimally in that temperature range. So any drop from that range means muscles work less effectively, which for a hummingbird could mean a very quick death. So torpor is not used to regulate daytime body temperatures, but at night or during periods of stress, the reduction in metabolic rate associated with torpor drives body temperature down.
All right. Steve asked, do hummingbirds use location, visual cues, temporal cues, or some combination to keep track of the blooms that are at peak and make subsequent visits to previously visited flowers?
Yes, they seem to do all of that. So, one recent paper that I came across that was published just last year was looking at just that and attempting really for the first time to characterize that trap lining behavior of hummingbirds and the choices that hummingbirds were making for when they foraged, where they foraged, and what flowers they visited directly coincided with the amount of nectar production in those flowers. So although we don't know exactly how they're learning this or like if it's instinctual, they are making very efficient and effective and optimal, really, decisions about where and how to forage, which I suppose is not very surprising because a lot of optimal foraging behavior on other birds like tits and sparrows show that those species as well make really effective optimal decisions to maximize energy intake. So it seems like hummingbirds are also doing that with a very different set of stimuli.
All right. Alan also is asking about visual cues to judge size. Can hummingbirds judge size? Is it possible the size of the wasps are being misjudged? Do they perceive other flying insects, other bees, or big flies as risks?
Oh, I love this question. So, um, it does not seem to be the case. So, when I was working on that paper, this is actually a question or a similar question brought up by a reviewer of that paper, who wanted to know, like, are they just avoiding it because it's a competitor, really, or because it's sharing the same resource? And there's a really great paper published out of Costa Rica at La Selva Biological Station that found similar findings, but also had the addition of Lepidoptera being foraging on flowers. So there were things like moths and butterflies, which are significantly larger than the wasps that were cohabiting along with the hummingbirds. And hummingbirds did not care if there were like an innocuous insect on the flowers, but if there was something with a stinger, their behavior was markedly different. So it doesn't seem to be generalized behavior. It seems to be some kind of awareness of that thing could hurt me if I'm going to anthropomorphize. I scoured the literature forever and could not find any evidence of what happens if a hummingbird is stung by a wasp. That does not seem to be published. Although there was one article that was published, I think in the 80s, of a hummingbird that died after it impaled uh, a bald-faced hornet. And there was a photo of the head of the hornet that was around the bill of the bird, so it couldn't open its mouth. It's quite a way to go. So it didn't seem to have been stung. It was like it stabbed the bee, the wasp, and then it was no longer able to open its bill. So there's other threats apparently than just getting stung by engaging with other insects in the environment. This is a wild publication for sure.
That's crazy.
Yeah, the
So
photo was wild.
Catherine, who you've inspired maybe to go back to school with your presentation,
Great.
um, it says asks about their diet and says that it's not restricted to just nectar or insects, but do they seek other missing nutrients? And she references butterflies that they puddle along streams or gather on carrion or feces to get different nutrients.
Yes, there's a lot of birds who will, for instance, collect snail shells or broken bits of shells for calcium and feed their offspring. In fact, those things. So I would not be surprised if hummingbirds do the same thing. There are very small snails that a hummingbird could obviously ingest, but I don't know if we have any documentation of hummingbirds doing that. But they certainly need to make sure that they have the appropriate balance of nutrients. They will consume a lot of pollen, either actively or sort of indirectly by engaging with flowers, which has a lot of nutrients in it, a lot of insects. There's a pretty wide diversity of their diet than just straight sugar. So, for instance, when hummingbirds are kept in captivity, if you just provide them with sugar, they'll do okay for a little while, but they'll become malnourished. So, you need to provide them a really sort of dynamic cocktail. Like they make a powdered mix for nectivorous birds that you can buy commercially and mix up with water that provides them complete nutrition. But anyway, long story short, they definitely are diversifying what's in their diet, and I would not be surprised, although I don't think there's documentation of it, of them eating things like shells in their environment when they encounter them.
All right, Adrian wants to know about those people on the ships. Have there been any education so that they know these migratory birds come and land on them, that they can help or at least not harm them?
I don't think there's any, I don't know for sure actually if folks are given any formal instruction. I would imagine that crews, especially if you think about like the Port of Baltimore, right? Those large cargo ships that are traversing the oceans for like captains of those ships, right, are on the ocean for a majority of their life, I would presume. They probably have a cultural awareness, right, that has spread from captain to captain of these events occurring. I know that there are some areas geographically where it tends to happen more often than others, like barrier islands, where tired birds is the first bit of land they see, and everybody comes down. Like there's one lighthouse, I'm thinking along the Gulf of Mexico, that often has migratory fallout, and they essentially shut the whole area down when there's the high concentration of birds there. But I don't know if the ship captains or people on ships are given much education. This sometimes happens on cruise ships, right, with thousands of people on board, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of birds on the boat. This happened one time when I was on a whale watching cruise in Maine. There was a warbler. I couldn't get a good shot of it, but like out in Canadian waters, just this random warbler just trying its best to like sit and hang out somewhere. And then it rode with us all the way back to the coast, and then it hopped off and went about its life, I hope. But so I don't think there's formal education, but I think that people who spend a lot of time on the water, on vessels in the water, are well aware that this is something that happens, especially in the fall and the spring when migration is at its peak.
Great, thank you. Is there a preference? Do they prefer feeders over flowers or vice versa?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if there's a strong preference. I think because our local hummingbirds are trapline foragers, they will incorporate your feeder happily into any route that they form. I will say though, oftentimes we do see ruby-throated hummingbirds defending artificial feeders more than they will defend your azalea bush, for example. Maybe this is just because we put our feeders places where we can see them. So it's a byproduct of just us being more observant of those areas because that's where we place them. It might be that the nectar resources in a feeder are artificially elevated, right? In terms of volume, in terms of quality, perhaps. So although they don't seem to use them exclusively, they do happily defend them and happily incorporate them into their usual feeding routes.
Where do they sleep?
That's a great question. This is something that I've been trying to study for a while. It's very difficult to find sleeping birds. I've been using thermal imaging cameras to try to find them. So stay tuned for that as well. The hummingbirds that I have found sleeping in the tropics in Nicaragua and Costa Rica have just been on a tiny branch like at eye level, like right up next to a porch. And they sleep there every night. Like you could just sit down, you could just bend over and touch them. It's pretty amazing. The natural history of sleep and why vertebrates sleep is really wildly unknown. We know it's needed, but we don't know why it's evolved in the first place or like how sleep happens in nature. And it's partially because it's very difficult to study. So, but all of my anecdotal evidence suggests that they find a comfortable perch, maybe just out in the open, and they just shut off for the night. It's pretty wild. They'll sleep anywhere, it seems.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have chickens, and you can do whatever you want to a chicken at night because they just don't do
Yeah,
anything.
we see a lot of sleeping birds in the tropics when I take students to the jungles and because we do a lot of night hikes and you'll just see these puffed up like kiskidees or hummingbirds or whatever just sitting there and we walk by them to dinner, we talking whatever and they just sit and sleep. It's wild.
Terry asked about facial recognition. Any familiarity and possible interaction flying around a window of a known home or person with a feeder?
That's a great question because there is also anecdotal stories from people with hummingbirds almost seeming to like recognize, okay, this person's coming out and they're the ones that bring me food. So I'm just going to sit here and wait. Some of you in this call might have had experiences like that. I don't know if they're at the cognitive abilities of facial recognition. That being said, yellow jackets can recognize each other by faces. And crows, which are a totally different story for a total different day, can recognize faces and tell their offspring and their offspring's offspring that you are a good person or a bad person. So hummingbirds being not a particularly social, in fact, very asocial species that doesn't rely too much on engaging one-on-one with another individual, probably don't have as well developed sense of facial recognition and memory of particular individuals over species that are social because it's ingrained in that sort of behavioral necessity of knowing who is who.
All right. Lloyd wanted to mention that offshore drill and production rig crews are often trained to help fall out migrants.
Oh, that is awesome. I'm so glad to know that. That's really,
Frank,
and it's so important because all they need is like a safe place with some water to rest, and then they go on their way. That's wonderful. I'm glad you could share that.
Frank asks, do we know anything about the hummingbird population in general? That is, their numbers, are they increasing, decreasing, longitudinal studies over time?
I think when I was preparing for this talk, I came across a number, I think of an estimate of about 30 million ruby-throated hummingbirds. I'm not sure where that estimate is coming from. But they are listed across the board as a species of least concern, which is great. Hopefully it stays that way. I would say with ruby-throated hummingbirds in general, in terms of their conservation outlook, are a challenge with any migratory birds because it's not just about conserving where they breed, which is just a tiny or a small proportion of where they spend their lives. It's also where they um, spend their non-breeding time. So conserving migratory species is challenging, becomes an international effort. And when you think about the political and social instability that happens in Central America and southern Mexico, it becomes a really big logistical challenge. But so far, it seems like hummingbird numbers in general are strong, that ruby-throated hummingbirds are not declining, although they do seem to be pretty spotty from year to year. So like the Eastern Shore, I'm always shocked by how few hummingbirds there are. And then I feel like I have friends on the Western Shore, right? In like Harford County that have tons of hummingbirds all the time. So they do seem to have very specific sort of bands that they move through, and they don't seem, anecdotally here, to be moving down the Eastern Shore as often as they do on the other side of Chesapeake Bay. But
All right. I think that covers all of the questions. Are there any other questions? You can raise your hand. You can, if you wanted to, I can call on you. We just had a bevy of questions in the chat.
really great questions too. This is awesome.
Yeah, go ahead, Adrian.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So you mentioned that it seemed like they prefer feeders just as well as natural sources of nectar. But as a native plant advocate, I'm wondering if really plants are better, and then especially native plants. And also, what kind of nutrition is there in the nectar other than sugar? Because you talked about they need different nutrients, and they only drink nectar. They don't eat insects or seeds or anything like that, right?
They definitely eat a lot of insects.
Oh, okay.
Yes, they do. So the chicks essentially only get insects, but even as adults, they will eat insects. So, um, like when I had them in captivity, there was a fellow researcher studying Drosophila and had like a fruit fly colonies, and when they wanted to eliminate some, I would put some in with my hummingbirds. And they just, again, anthropomorphizing, seem to be having a blast. They were just zipping all around, chomping up all the fruit flies. So they love insects, which is a big supplement to their high energy that's coming from the nectar. The nectar really is primarily sugars, but in the action of eating the nectar, they're also consuming quite a large amount, it would seem, of pollen when we look at gut analyses. And pollen is very high in protein as well, and other sorts of amino acids, since it's that protective coat and then the sperm of the plant on the inside. So although they're using the nectar primarily for like the energy source that they need, they're engaging with a lot of other parts of their diet that are filling out the complement of minerals and vitamins and other nutrients that are not energy-based intakes.
So that would seem to support that the feeders may not be as good because they wouldn't be providing all those extra nutrients. Then also, aren't you supposed to clean the feeders like weekly, and many people don't clean them?
Yeah, so cleaning, that is one important thing to say, right? With the cleaning, they should be kept clean. Like whenever they start to even get a little bit foggy, you should dump them out and replace it. They definitely don't need the red food dye, right? Like just straight sugar and water mixed together is great. A 3-to-1 ratio. So nutritionally, sugar water feeders or artificial feeders are far inferior to like the native plants that they would be engaging with. So, but they don't seem to be using them as a sole source of energy. They just sort of loop them into their energy intake, like into their trap lines. So I would argue that especially if we're worried about the fact that our native flowering plants are on the decline. And especially in a lot of people's backyards, they might not even exist whatsoever. That having a feeder to supplement and to augment the amount of sugar that can help the hummingbirds build up like migratory fat reserves might be a really critical aspect of supplementing for the damage that we as humans have done to our like native plant communities. Ideally, right, the hummingbirds don't need our feeders at all, and they can just do their trap lines through our native plant communities and pollinate our native plants. And they definitely do that when I'm out in the grasslands, which are about 200 acres, and there's no artificial feeders in sight. Like they have huge trap lines, and I see them all the time visiting all kinds of flowers. So they definitely don't need our feeders. But I think it probably does help them, especially when it comes to building up fat reserves for migration.
Well, I'm going to cling to the part you said that because I'm really such a native plant advocate and I want to motivate people. So maybe I can tell them, well, if you're lazy, you can just do a feeder. But no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
But
no, I think, yeah.
because people are getting on board with native plants, and I volunteer at nearby native plant nursery and so on. So to me, this is another rationale because a lot of people do enjoy hummingbirds. It's
Oh,
another rationale
absolutely.
to plant native
Absolutely.
honeysuckle. Yeah, Laniceris sempervirens and natives like that.
Yes, if there was a native plant population or community around someone's home that was healthy and vibrant, the hummingbirds would be there. There would be no need for feeders at all. Feeders help bring birds to where for people to enjoy selfishly, where there aren't native plants, but I would definitely use that as a way of advocating for native plants. I support you 100%. Yes.
Okay, great.
All right. Linda says, this is a couple of interesting questions here. Since hummers are high energy consumers, why do they expend so much energy in protecting their feeders by driving other hummers away, especially when there are flowers that they could also visit?
It's a great question. I'm going to make some conjectures here based on sort of a natural scenario, right? Because our hummingbirds have not evolved with feeders as a selective pressure, evolutionarily speaking. So in nature, if a hummingbird found this flower that was producing a lot of really wonderful resources and was perpetually high sugar, like that would be a really high quality resource that you would not want to share with others, right? Natural selection and evolution favors selfishness, right? So you want to pass on your own genes. You don't care about whoever else is in your population. So I think it's that, right? We're providing almost like this supernatural stimulus, like more intense than normal, which is what that supernatural means. And that triggers this really proportionally more intense territoriality around a resource that in nature doesn't exist, but because it does, and they're so honed in on defending good resources, they just sort of lose it, it seems, right? That would be my guess. Yeah.
All right. Lloyd, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Lloyd.
Just a quick comment. You mentioned the Eastern Shore being not so heavy in hummingbirds compared to the Western. Probably it's the flowering plant distinction as well. Eastern Shore very much in monoculture agriculture, much more variety of flowering plants and many more people plant for birds and etc. Native plant societies and all that on the Western Shore. My guess would be that would be your reason.
Yeah, I think you might be onto something there. And also with all the Phragmites that moves into coastal wetlands and
Oh yeah,
pushes
right.
out, right? Like that's not a great resource for hummingbirds either. So I think you're spot on there, Lloyd. I think it's a
Well, and sea
resource
level rise
availability issue.
yeah, sea level rise, ghost forest, a lot of understory being lost, etc.
Yes.
Whereas the Western Shore ultimately may see that, but it's not yet,
Mm-hmm.
By the way,
All
great.
right.
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
And one to end on, unless somebody else wants to raise their hand, since hummers release water in that really unique way that you described, do they also produce regular bird excrement as well?
They do, for sure. You don't often see it in nature. When I've had them in the lab, I've had the joy of encountering that. So they do produce excrement very similar, although much smaller, as you might expect, to bird. There's the brown fecal matter, which is from the digestive waste, and then there's the white uric acid component, which is coming from the kidneys and the release of the kidneys. So there's that in addition to the stream of water that's just coming right out of the digestive system. So you probably won't find it in nature because it's so small, unless they're defecating like on your porch where you have a feeder, you might encounter it there.
So everything poops,
That's right, even hummingbirds.
even hummingbirds. Well, Dr. Rinehimer, this has been a phenomenal presentation, and we're going to have you back to continue to teach us about some other things that you're working on, if you would agree to that.
I've got so many things I could talk about. Happy to do it.
Great, great. Well, we'll put you on the rotation then.
Thanks.
On our track line of for hummingbirds.
Perfect. I love that.
Yeah, and everybody, thanks for joining us tonight for Must Learn Thursday. Next week is horseshoe crabs. You can never get enough horseshoe crabs. It's the spawn of the horseshoe crab. So come back and learn about that next week. And in the meantime, stay well, stay curious, and stay outside. And be looking for those ruby-throated hummingbirds. They're here. They're coming. See if you can find some.
Thank you again for the invitation. It was such a pleasure, and the wonderful questions. They were a delight.
All right, everybody. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Good night.
Good night.